And now, for a conversation in the pursuit of liberation, please welcome Reverend William H. Lamar IV, Dr. Leslie Ford, Dr. Stacey Patton, and Dr. Raymond Winbush.
It is an extraordinary privilege and joy to be in this space with you. Isn't this a beautiful space? And as I was thinking of the beauty of this space and listening to the sublime playing of Sister Dana, I was truly transported. She played the Lord's Prayer. And what we often forget is there is a phrase in that prayer that is translated on earth. That we are concerned about what happens to people on earth. How we can transform what power relationships look like on earth. How justice can come on earth, how all of us can thrive and flourish together on earth, and for that we are thankful. I'm also reminded because spaces can transport us and awaken memories. I grew up in the St. Paul AME Church in Macon, Georgia, and every Sunday, reparations were spoken from the pulpit, but we had no idea that that was what was being communicated. When we would take up the offering, we would quote this passage, "Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have taken anything from any man by false accusation, I restore him fourfold." Reparations in the revolutionary gospel in the church, but we did not have eyes to see nor ears to hear that in that revolutionary gospel, reparations. And for this individual, there was no salvation communally, nor for him as an individual, unless he participated in repair. Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And we know that much has been taken in this nation by false accusation, and restoration is a must. And I know church has been a part of the problem, but I'm thankful that we gather in this space because deep in its tradition, exists solutions. So I'm thankful today to have with me extraordinary human beings, Doctors Patton, Winbush, and Ford. And our first question, briefly tell us about yourselves and how you came to work on reparations. And let me begin with Dr. Patton.
Hi, everyone. So I work at Morgan State University's Institute for Urban Research with Dr. Winbush. I'm a journalist and a historian. And I'd like to tell you about my journey by starting with a very powerful insight. And I need a script because I'm trying to practice brevity and self-containment. So, number one, good black health is a threat to racist capitalism. White supremacy, let me rephrase that. White insecurity requires an unbroken chain of black sickness and death. And this is an intergenerational mandate. And this is what my reparations work has taught me. And so my journey began as a journalist and a historian specializing in African American history with a specific focus on the plight of Black childhood. So through this lens, I saw the profound echoes resonating within our present medical outcomes. So it's looking at oral histories, it's looking at data, because data is history. It's looking at the testimonies and experiences of African Americans of all ages on the plantation that I started to see these generational echoes. And even in the absence of overt systems today, like slavery and Jim Crow segregation, we see these persistent racial disparities in medical outcomes. And they're a stark indictment on just how entrenched structures of systemic racism continue to be. And so I've also learned that slavery indelibly altered not just our bodies, but the very essence of our beings, our brains, our nervous systems, immune systems, reproductive outcomes, our psychology, our cells, our genes, the way they express themselves, our lifespans, and even our unborn generations bear the enduring scars of this egregious chapter. And so, as I delve into this work, I can't help but wonder about some important questions that I hope we'll think about as we move through this panel today. What if our ancestors were never taken from Africa and forced into slavery? How different would our bodies be? What if our bodies had not been forced to accumulate and store these violent sensory experiences, these memories for generations? And what would the data reveal about our health outcomes today? How many Black people would be alive with us walking the earth today without those systems in place?
Thank you very much. Dr. Winbush.
I was teaching troubling. When I was teaching at Vanderbilt in the 90s, I heard a speech by Queen Mother Moore. How many of you know who Queen Mother Moore is? Black folk know, okay. And she said something, sometimes one sentence can change how you look at things. And she said, everything that Black people have been doing in this country since they first were robbed out of their homeland in 1441 was to repair the damage that white people had created. And that changed, what I started doing. I started doing research on reparations when it wasn't popular. And Randall Robinson, my blessed ancestor, wrote a book in the late 90s called The Debt. And he and I were doing a workshop in Toronto, and he said, Ray, I did an essay, but you need to do a book with data in it. So out of that came Should America Pay, my first book on reparations. And I followed up with Belinda's Petition, a sister in 1782 that got reparations. And I've been pursuing it ever since. It's been a lonely journey, and now it's popular. I used to get 1 or 2 engagements about reparations a year. And now, since I've been in this meeting, 3, all said no. So that's it. That was basically it.
Thank you. Dr. Ford.
Hi, good afternoon. Is my mic on? Everybody can hear me? Okay. All right. Good afternoon. My name is LesLeigh Ford. I'm an Associate Director in the Office of Race and Equity Research at the Urban Institute. And my journey to reparations research and policy is a winding one. So I was a classroom teacher in Detroit, Michigan, which is where I grew up. I'm a 3rd-generation teacher. And for a long time, I believed that education sort of was the tool for upward mobility. And after teaching for many years and working in communities and neighborhoods and learning from my mother, my aunt, my grandmother, who were all teachers, I became convinced that the systems and the structures that were creating the context in which my students lived and that their parents navigated and that their grandparents and ancestors sort of came to experience on a day-to-day basis was far more consequential than just simply a high school diploma or attending like a post-secondary college or university. And after going back to graduate school and coming to DC and working for a couple of years, I really became more serious about understanding the consequences of wealth inequity and the consequences of wealth stripping for Black Americans. And I began to really take seriously what would it mean to develop 2 things. So first, building on, the legacy and the scholarship of folks like Randall Robinson and Professor Charles Ogletree and Deidre Palmer and others. I really just wanted to understand today, what would it take to build a reparations agenda that social scientists could actually build on and contribute to? Not because I think evidence is the solution to catalyzing momentum or interest in reparations, but for some people, evidence is the entry point. So I published a brief about 2 things. First, the policy history of reparations in this country, the groups and the target populations who actually were able to receive reparations for harms that were incurred, and the barriers that have existed and the resistance that has existed to reparations as a policy solution for Black Americans, from enslavement to Jim Crow to American apartheid to today. And then the second, again, was a national reparations research agenda with questions that, if were taken seriously by social scientists actually had the potential to answer some of the unanswered questions that, again, I believe could seriously motivate policy action towards both a federal or national reparations program or agenda, and could also, which I'll touch on later, could also potentially motivate the private sector to take action on reparations as well.
So we have an opportunity now to dive more deeply with these extraordinary people. I want to start with you, Dr. Patton. You've done extensive research of the medical harms exacted on African Americans. Can you give us an historical understanding of medical terror that has been experienced here by persons of African ancestry?
So DC didn't have an organized, sort of systematized medical structure until after the Civil War. And any medical care that enslaved people got was really at the discretion of slaveholders. But in terms of some of the medical harms Black people were subjected to, a litany of abuses. Things like involuntary experimentation, brutal surgical procedures, all performed without consent, sometimes anesthesia. These atrocities included experiments in gynecology, forced sterilizations, the use of enslaved bodies for anatomical dissections in the medical space and even in some universities as well. In DC, there was a robust system of grave robbing, so Black cemeteries were often raided, and those bodies were dug up and sold to medical schools here in DC so that people could complete their medical education. So Black people were treated as disposable subjects for all kinds of scientific inquiry, and some of those findings would be published in our top medical journals, where people who were getting their professional prestige could make a name for themselves and status, professional status for themselves based off of crude projects done on Black people. Such acts not only inflicted physical harm, but perpetuated a dehumanizing narrative that justified the continued exploitation of Black bodies. So there's this idea that Black people were insensate, that they didn't experience pain of the same way that white bodies did. And all of this was for the benefit of white practitioners. Black people were exposed to harsh living conditions, so unsanitary, overcrowded, conditions which were a breeding ground for all kinds of infectious diseases. They had inadequate shelter, lack of proper sanitation. So we see a higher prevalence when we start seeing the data getting collected by late 19th century in public health data. We see these disparities being documented. Black people had limited control over their own reproductive health. So there was forced breeding for economic purposes. So Black people lacked autonomy over things like family planning. And of course, this affected health conditions across generations. Of course, there's nutritional deprivation, which is richly documented in the historical literature. So they didn't have access to proper food and nutrition. So there was rampant malnutrition during critical periods, especially of child development. And we continue to see that in our food apartheid systems today. And talked about infectious diseases, but I also want to talk very quickly about mortality rates. I had slides, but I had to be complex, so they can't put them all there, so I'm just going to go through these really quick. So I said earlier that data is history, and so we can use census data along with the oral history narratives. This makes me laugh when I think about the debates against, or the attacks against critical race theory, because I'm always like, I'm just using the very documents that you created that told us very proudly and boldly what you did to us. So the census data can tell us a lot about these racial outcomes. So if you look at 1820, 1830, 1840, all the way to 1850, you'll see the data, which should, these mortality outcomes, which should look like a pyramid. So if there's equity, but it's really lopsided. I wish I could show you guys. But what we see is that the majority of enslaved children didn't live past age 10. And in comparison to white children as well. And then when they do live past age 10, they have very shortened lifespans in adulthood. And we can see on the white side of the pyramid, the population numbers stay pretty stable. And then you can go neighborhood by neighborhood in the district, and you can see the mortality rates by neighborhood also reflect those disparities quite wildly. And so we see across those decades, the 1810 census, by the way, is missing for some reason. You can't find it. But what we see over this time, the pre-Civil War time period, is that 1 in every 4 children by the age of 10 dies in the district. And that had consequences for families on the psychological and economical level. And so what does this data mean in terms of infant mortality? It's stolen labor, right? It's stolen, wealth, and it's generational trauma that keeps accumulating and compounding over time. I had this wonderful infographic where I looked at the enslaved population in 1800, which was 2,072 people. The white population is 5,672. When we look at the premature deaths, it's 420 per year during that census period in 1820. By the time we get to 1860, this is for the Civil War, the enslaved population rises to 3,185. And the white population is 60,696. And Black people were having 3,840 premature enslaved deaths per year. So the numbers kept growing. And so what does this mean? I have this little summary here, and then I'll wrap up because I know the clock is ticking. So that means that Black people enslaved women were giving birth to upwards of over 1,000 children per year. Following then the child mortality rates of those 1,000 births, over 200 of those babies would not survive past the age of 10. And so in a 10-year census, this would lead to over 2,000 children dying. And this is just comparative, this is just big numbers in a really small district. And so if we put numbers to that, and I have this whole, explanation of how I did the data, and I'm happy to send you the slides for the full narrative, that amounts to about, let's see here, from 1800 to 1860, enslaved individuals would have worked a collective total of over 665 million hours. And the average enslaved individual in the District of Columbia would have produced almost $3.5 million over the course of their life in 2020 dollars. So if we put all those numbers together, that means a loss of $380 billion to Black folks. So I mapped all this out without the visuals, unfortunately, to show that there's intersections between health, mortality, which is determined by these environmental structures, which then has consequences for our economic life and vitality. And this is accumulated across generations. The neuroscience and the literature on psychology and epigenetics is very strong. It makes a very strong case for how these outcomes continue to affect us because our bodies still hold these memories, these experiences. It wasn't like we were freed and then on the plantations there were a bunch of psychologists who said, come, let's talk about what happened to your families, let's talk about that brutal rape, that whipping, those sorts of things. We never got a chance to restore our bodies and to heal from this experience because those centuries-long experiences were compounded by more terror that continues to be with us today. So I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Patton. Extraordinary information, sobering, and yeah. So, Dr. Winbush, why reparations in the first place? Why are Black people calling for them now? And as you said, it's become popular. You were once a voice crying out in the wilderness, now you've got a whole lot of company. Many people want to compartmentalize the harm that's been done to Black folks, and you summarily reject this compartmentalization. And just tell us why.
Well, I want to read a quote from ancestor Audre Lorde. Y'all know she says, and many of you have heard this, but the rest of the quote is often dropped off. It says, "For the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." And this is why I think the entire system has to be challenged. You know, and the system that I'm talking about is the system of white supremacy. Stacey and I, and Nadia Hippolyte from New York, we've been working on a grant for the past almost 8 months as a gift from the IF Foundation to give Timmy I don't think anybody in this country, including the Ford Foundation, Kellogg, or whatever, would have funded the research. But what we did was a deep dive into where and who owes reparations. Now, in terms of why are we here now, let me give this quick summary. You know, it's like trying to summarize what was 583 years in the making in about 7 or 8 minutes. Reparations, first of all, have always been on the lips of Black folk. The first written study that we, if you want to call it a study or a case we had, was Elizabeth Mumbet, the grandmother of W.B. Du Bois. She filed a lawsuit in Massachusetts. There's some similarities there. In 1780, a year later, Belinda Royal Sutton also filed a lawsuit. Both of them won their cases about reparations. So essentially, and I know this is a hard statement to swallow, but Black people essentially have been spending the past 583 years cleaning up white folks' mess. That's not my quote, it's from Sir Hilary Beckles. And I think what we do is that we use sanitized words to describe the system of white supremacy. For example, in my area, education, we say the educational gap, which is white supremacy. We say health inequities, which is white supremacy. Or when we're dealing with youth, over-incarceration, the school to prison pipeline. All of these point to a system of white supremacy. Ta-Nehisi Coates himself, you know Ta-Nehisi, okay, says that white privilege is a soft way of saying white supremacy, because we don't want to hear that term. So most recently, we hear the term racial wealth gap. And if you remember, now this term has always been around, but it really accelerated, probably 6-7 years ago. And I always think that the system of white supremacy brags when it says, and I've heard it at the conference, that Black folk won't economically catch up to white people for 76 trillion years or something like that. And I think what we do, brother, is that we always associate Black poverty with enslavement, but we never associated white wealth with enslavement. And that's very important to understand. White folks got a lot of their money from us. And as Stacey just said, the tune in DC alone, that we calculated $380 billion. So reparations activists, scholars, and politicians are pointing fingers now at who owes us and how much they owe. And then finally, I think we have to ask the question. We usually, I'm asked to speak a lot of times like saying, is there racism in education? Or is there racism in healthcare? Or is there racism in entertainment? Or is there racism in religion? I think what we should be asking, is there education in racism? Is there healthcare in racism? Or is there entertainment in racism? I look at it as an entire system. And I was glad to hear my brother from that just spoke, when you talk about a systemic approach to it. And so, and I was a little disappointed. We kind of punched each other when we heard it. When there was a woman on this last video that said something like, beside reparations. Let's do this beside reparations. You cannot do it without reparations. That's the only way you're going to close the so-called racial wealth.
Thank you, Dr. Winbush, as always, enlightening. Dr. Ford, he's laughing, but really it's enlightening. Dr. Ford, so what Drs. Patton and Winbush said really get at this conversation around the economics of the harm that has occurred, and that harm continues unbroken to this very day in its connection to wealth and economics and health. So how do you, from your vantage point and expertise, approach this question of reparations?
So I want to just lead with, I'm actually trained as a family sociologist. And so when I think about, again, sort of my entry point to thinking about reparations, it's really from the perspective of how would reparations improve the quality of life for individuals, for parents and their children, for individual families, for communities. And, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of my work and research at Urban focuses on wealth building, economic mobility. And I remain convinced that all of the other areas that I've studied that are of importance, including health policy and other things, as Dr. Winbush just mentioned, cannot be solved or addressed adequately without reparations. So even with the implementation of race-conscious policy solutions, without reparations in whatever form is most beneficial to Black Americans, we are not going to solve the deep inequities, even setting wealth aside and maybe just focusing on health for a moment. There's no way to radically transform health care to health systems, access to care, racial concordance in healthcare providers, and all of the other dimensions and aspects of health policy that we know are important without the implementation of reparations in some form. And I also just want to note that among all the research that exists, it's not sufficient to just converge the racial wealth gap, but it is necessary to both converge the racial wealth gap and reimagine and reconstitute the systems that have exacerbated the consequences of wealth inequity and all of the other inequities, to reimagine sort of a different system in which we can all exist and operate and thrive. And again, without reparations, that just simply isn't possible. So I just wanted to kind of lead with that. And just in terms of my research, in addition to, like Dr. Patton and like Dr. Winbush, I look to, the past and past policies to help me understand sort of how did we get here today. It isn't just that an education achievement gap exists sort of organically and naturally because African Americans and Black folks in this country are somehow deficient. But I can look back to, my grandmother teaching in a one-room schoolhouse in North Central Florida, and that is maybe my sort of mental starting point. How was our family at such a significant disadvantage post-enslavement for so many decades? And, sort of building from that individual sort of family perspective, sort of building out to the communities and systems that sort of existed and operated that allowed that system to be maintained. So I just want to give like a couple of quick examples, some of which I know will be super familiar to this, this group. And it's just sort of leading me to one of the things that I'm really thinking about today. And it is not to get away from the broader conversation of economic justice and health equity, but I'm starting to sort of narrow in on just a particular case that I think has a lot of potential for potentially advancing progress on reparations at the federal level. So we all are super familiar with the rise of unions and like union formation in the US, and the ways that unions sort of helped pave a path to the middle class for white Americans, and at the same time locked out or blocked Black folks from being able to be members and enjoy some of the same benefits of union participation, relegated Black folks to lower wage and much more dangerous, unsafe jobs. We also are very familiar with the Federal Housing Administration's efforts to block, not insure Black mortgages, relegate Black folks to buying predominantly Black neighborhoods, insuring mortgages, enforcing racial covenants, contributing to the development of suburbs around the US for the benefit of the white middle class. And then lastly, we're also super familiar with the 1944 Federal Servicemen's Readjustment Act. So we know that Black veterans and Black World War II veterans were deprived of the rights that they were due, both in terms of education assistance and housing benefits. So I just want to sort of narrow in on Black veterans as a particular case. In 2021, a bill was put forth to pay reparations to Black veterans and to their wives or spouses and their descendants. And that bill has not yet advanced. But I think it is just a really interesting and particular case, both because we know how public discourse works around veterans and men and women who have served their country. We also know that Black men and women returned home to a segregated United States and were not able to sort of, again, fully benefit from the programs and policies that were available to white Americans. So I just say that to say, researchers have estimated that white veterans were able to benefit to the tune of almost $200,000 in today's US dollars by receiving GI benefits, again, that Black American men and servicemen and women were locked out of. And so if we were to just think about, just as an experiment, what it would mean for just servicemen to receive those benefits and their families, that we could potentially build some momentum, some interest, and some energy around reparations in that singular form, and then from there start to build out what a broader reparations and broader national policy could look like for Black Americans. And I just received a sign that we need to move to Q&A, so my apologies.
No, thank you, Dr. Ford. Now, we do have an opportunity for you all to place your wisdom, your questions, your wrestlings, your ruminations in the space, so we'd love to hear from you.
I don't so much have a question, but I do want to point out some actions that were taken by the federal government and that assisted in creating white wealth. The Homestead Act created 42 million white millionaire households. Okay? 42 million. I think when we're looking at this, we need to have a very clear understanding of what is the system of white supremacy? What is the purpose? What are the tools that were used in order to create these racial gaps in education and wealth? Why? It was to create wealth and stability for white people at the expense of black people. Because you're going to find that people are going to push back. Why do you need to get reparations? Why does reparations have to be monetary? Because what you took out created monetary benefits that created the privilege that allows you to walk around, pull out a gun on a white cop and live. Or you, when you're ready to come into Chocolate City and take it and gentrify it and make it cappuccino top. With no marches, you didn't have to sign a petition, you didn't have to go and whip out studies, you didn't have to convince anyone that this is what should be built in order for you to be comfortable. But when it comes to us and what we need, we have to have studies that prove that toxic chemicals have an effect. But you're not going to allow them to move those waste dumps, them trucks, the emissions, all of those things to come into your neighborhood. But we have to have conferences after conferences, papers after papers, to try to convince you that the long-term effects of the practice of enslavement that you started as a collective Europeans in 1441 to inflict on us as a collective black people for your benefit. We have to be clear on keeping the focus and not allowing them to move us from talking about the system of white supremacy and call it systemic racism. Because the system of white supremacy is duplicitous. Because when you start talking about systemic racism and things of that sort, it creates the notion that we all have the same opportunity to be racist, and we do not. So I just want to make sure that we have that in mind whenever we start to look at these things that we want to do. Because that's why the system of white supremacy continues to flourish. Because they're very adept at controlling the language, controlling the narrative. And we have to make sure that the narrative stays with us and the demand comes from us.
Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you all so much for this wisdom. My question is kind of related to, kind of challenging the system. You all have spoke about, us already knowing the evidence. You kind of already know the information. And what more do we need to prove that racism and white supremacy is prevalent within this country? So my question is kind of related to really looking at mechanisms to challenge the systems. I know we have Title VI complaints, but what are kind of those success stories related to, challenging the systems using kind of the mechanisms that were given us by the system in order to challenge the system? Because we've seen times and times again, we kind of have to do the testing, even for the environmental implications. We have to have the EPA come out to do more testings to look at chemicals, but we already know those things are having a health impact, but yet they aren't necessarily studying the health impacts of the presence of these chemicals. So how do we actually make sure that those mechanisms are, fully comprehensive and really getting to the root of why these things are happening? Because we know the racist policy, we know a lot of this stuff is rooted in zoning laws and rooted in how our, environments are, created. So how do we do that, either using Title VI or using other mechanisms you all have came across your research?
I would say, and that's a great question, that not everybody knows. Academics know, in our silos, in our journals, but what we really need are public health campaigns to come back into the third spaces that the gentleman was talking about earlier, and bringing this information to communities to let them see, have these community conversations in churches, in schools, and meet people where they are in terms of their understanding, and not be speaking up here and at the ground level and giving people the information and the strategies. I think we need, massive public health education around all of these issues, because people are in survival mode. They're just trying to put one foot in front of the other, pay their bills, feed their kids, And we have to come into these spaces. Our academic class needs to do a much better job of getting this information out to folks.
Just really quickly building on that point, just when I think about like the K-12 education system, I think that there's a huge opportunity for curriculum to be honest and transparent and actually reflect the real lived experience of Black Americans in this country. And I'm really concerned about the whitewashing that has already happened and taken place, but then like what it will look like, you know, in 10 or 15 years in places like Florida, Texas, and other states.
Yeah, and I'd like to, you know, quickly say that, you know, when I look around, I see, you know, political cavemen like Ron DeSantis in Florida trying to destroy Black studies. You know, I think that, you know, the system understands that if you destroy people's memories, you destroy people's ability to act or knowledge stuff. So I would be remiss as a professor unless I, you know, talk about somebody's book. This book just got published last week. I'm talking literally last week. It's written by a white person. I didn't write it. A guy named Andrew Carl. It's called The Black Tax. You should read this book. I've already read it 1 week. I'm sorry. And it's a fantastic book in the sense that it documents, you know, what happened to Black folk, how white wealth was built on Black labor, free Black labor, and over a period of the past 150 years. So I think teaching history is important as an academic. You know, I think just talking about what happened to Black folk, you know, into K through 12, college and so forth, just talking about it to mom and dad and neighbors and other people like that.
Thank you for your question. Yes, ma'am.
Patel. And I'm going to start my question with a thank you to the panel, but to Dr. Winbush. So in the mid-90s, I was a student at Vanderbilt University. Predominantly white institution for folks who may not know, at least super white. Now, it was 90% white then, and I found a home at the Bishop Joseph Johnson Black Cultural Center, which would remember me as a young 17-year-old, but I think of that as the beginning of my political education, a place that I found belonging in this very white institution. And I was listening to your comments. You probably don't remember me, but I certainly remember you. Nisha Patel. I like to think so. We'll see. But I think about, you know, the highest compliment someone once gave me was a young Black man. He said to me when I left a job, he said, you know, you don't know that you're teaching us, and we're learning so much, and you don't even know you're teaching us. And I want to pay that, I guess, backward to you. It somehow seeped into my skin and is as responsible as anything else for why I do the work I do today, which my whole career has been about social change, with a big focus on race and gender. But enough about me. The question I want to ask you and all of the panelists, I think about this room. We're literally in a church, and I feel like everybody that has spoken has dropped a lot of wisdom, but is preaching to the choir. The folks in this room are bought in. You're talking to majority Black, majority people of color room. And I think about the other 90% of the students on that very white campus where I went to school, and the increasing numbers of white people that are moving into this city that has become my adopted home. How do we get the people who aren't in the choir to understand the messages and to shift those narratives and to shift those mindsets? And like, very specifically, that's the big question. The maybe smaller question is, I'm curious with Dr. Winbush, like those other 90% of students, many of whom walked onto that campus with incredible wealth and perhaps have accumulated even more. Do you think you got through to any of them? And if so, how? And if not, how did you do it?
Well, one person I know I got through was Michelle Alexander.
She's Black.
Right, she was Black. She wrote the book about mass incarceration. She was one of my students. You know, I always divide issues of reparations up into three groups of people. It's, you know, I hope I don't step on anybody's toes. the first group are like the people I'm never going to reach. The people that follow Donald Trump. I don't think I'm going to reach them. I might be wrong, but I don't think I'm going to reach them. The second group are the people like in this room that I think I can reach and already are educated about the inequities that confront African people in this country. And the middle group, I think, are on the fence, you know, and that's the group I try to target. I've given up on that right, you know, I don't want to call it flyover country because they don't like to use that term. But, you know, I've given up on people. I'm more pessimistic now than when I was at Vanderbilt.
You think I mentioned it?
No. Well, you provide hope, but, you know, I've gotten calls from some white students at Vanderbilt who I taught years ago. One called me about 2 weeks ago, and he said he wanted to thank me. I don't even remember. You know, he gave me his name. I remember you, though. And he just, you weren't then either. But see, I think that, you know, sometimes you touch people's lives, you just don't know. You know, maybe Ron DeSantis one day will be converted to reparations. I don't think so. But I try to appeal to that group that's kind of on the fence and willing to listen.
So I have two perspectives on this, depending on my mood on any given day. Sometimes I'm like, I'm talking to my people to help us understand what this system did to us, how it changed us, how it poisoned our natural ways of being in kinship with each other, how it's intentionally designed to keep us in survival mode and operating from a space of survival with each other. I think about Toni Morrison, who just says, erase white people from the canvas so we can see our beauty, our potential, and richness in a very undistorted way. So some days I'm firmly there. On other days, I'm putting whiteness under the microscope to show its pathology and the roots of its pathology. So this is why I center childhood. My next book is about the lynching of children. It's called Strung Up: How White People Learn to Lynch Black Children. It's a socialization process. It doesn't begin in the American South. It doesn't begin with Black people, Black adults or children as victims. It begins in the nascent stages of Western civilization. The first children to be lynched were white children. And they carry that tradition, those cultural traditions and practices across the ocean here. And so what I do is I look at adverse childhood experiences for thousands of years in Europe and how those pan-continental experiences primed white people to be adept at colonizing, enslaving, and continuing these, generational traumas against groups of people that they've colonized. And so we talk about healing and all these structural things that need to happen, building new systems and such, but we can't do that. We can't do that kind of healing until white people stop and look at their own histories of trauma within their families, within their communities, within their ancestral histories. We can't do any of that until they purge those old ghosts, which are constantly reaching out for new victims and require these systems to perpetuate those old traumas. So that's where I am on any given day, depending on my mood.
I'll just be really, really brief. So one of my main sort of goals right now is to just motivate as many corporations, philanthropy, funders, and others to actually consider how they built, other companies or organizations or industries built their wealth, and whether they would even consider sort of small steps towards reparative action. So even if I'm not calling it reparations, which I tend to think of like a national or federal program, if there are things that individual institutions or corporations might be willing to do, whether it's portions of their income, dedicated programs, something like, at that level, and that's just something that I'm sort of trying to build my persuasive muscle on.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Reverend Dawn Sanders, and I'm so grateful for this presentation today. I have a question for Dr. Ford specifically because you pricked my heart today with the information you just shared. Several months ago, I asked my father for my grandfather's discharge papers. He was a veteran and he died several years back, but he was born in 1915. I never knew what branch of military he was in, and as my dad shared the paperwork with me, I burst out into tears, but I didn't know why. And I think I might burst out into tears, but I hope I'm gonna get this through. I didn't know why, but God kept telling me, go to Navy Credit Union, go to Navy Credit Union. I'm like, what am I going to Navy Credit? I don't have no account over there. What am I going over there for? Get all the way over there, I'm like, I don't know why I'm here. I think I'm supposed to do something with an account, so on and so forth. I have a business, and so on and so forth. Long story long, I needed his discharge papers to be a member of and I burst out crying because I didn't even know he was in the Navy. I never knew those stories. I never knew anything about what branch, what he did, how he did it. I didn't know any of that. And so I am working currently with Leadership Exchange in South Africa, working with individuals, doing equity work. I've been doing this work for others, but in a very practical way, I want to know how can I help with this policy piece for veterans around reparations, because I didn't even know it existed. And also, if there's a specific action I can take to speak to legislative leaders that I could do in a very practical way as a descendant of a veteran who I'm sure never even imagined that there would be anyone pulling his discharge papers to find out he was honorably discharged and that there'd be anything left for his family. So I just want to, just on a practical level, ask how I could be intentional about doing something to support that effort.
First, thank you so much for sharing your story, and I'm so sorry for your family's loss, but also really thankful for this connection that you're now sort of able to carry forward. There are a few things that come to mind. So I actually do not know today where the status of the legislation that was introduced in 2021 stands. My assumption is that the bill just simply was not advanced because there just simply was not enough sort of congressional, sort of bipartisan support to advance the bill. But I tend to think that both reaching out to your local or your state or representatives, senators, and sort of specifically pointing to the piece of legislation that you're interested in knowing where they stand on and what you can do to support is sort of like a really great starting point. And then if you wanted to, there's a recent Academy of, I believe, Arts and Sciences paper that just came out. And there's essentially a number of researchers and advocates who are planning to advance some additional policy action towards pursuing reparations for the descendants of Black veterans in the U.S. If I can get your contact information, I'll absolutely send you the paper. Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm thinking about the fact I will have been Black for 50 years come August. Thank you, sir, thank you. And there's certain things in Black households you cannot say if you grew up like I did. You could not say the word lie. How many of y'all grew up in that household? We had to say fib or told a story, but you could not say lie. I think that reparations has a similar career amongst the rhetoric of Black people. It's a word that we won't say. We're afraid of it. We think it's impractical. How can you help us to expand our imaginations so that particularly, again, I'm talking about the Black people who are afraid of this word, like my grandparents may be afraid, I'm afraid looking for them right now just for saying the word lie in the room. How can we make this a more practical part of our conversations and leaven this loaf with the truth that this is something we have always spoken of, that we have always built toward? Help me, help us.
Well, I think you got to use it. You know, I'm reading a lot of literature now where people say, well, let's not call it reparations, Ray. Let's call it compensatory justice. You know, what is that? You know, reparations gets at the heart of what, and I don't back off the word. I've never backed off the word. And again, Randall Robinson, rest his soul, said we should always use the word. So I think we got to just teach our people that. You know, there's
Don't start censoring yourself now, sir.
Well, I'm just saying that there's a group of confused black people now, that's all I'm gonna say. And they're propagating this idea that, well, only certain groups of black people should get reparations. I've actually had those in that first group that I talked about with Ron DeSantis. Because again, there's some black folk, I ain't gonna get to Candace Owens. I know, y'all know who Candace Owens is. I'm not gonna get to her. You know, so I think that there's certain people that you teach, but I do not back off the word reparations. And people have asked me, could you come here and speak about compensatory justice? I said, what is that? I said, I'll speak about reparations. Well, you know, do you have to use that word? Yes, we have to do that. So I think a lot of it is a process of education.
I don't know those kind of black people that I haven't met them in the spaces where I do work across the country.
I need to follow you around, man.
So I'll give you an example. When I was in my PhD program, David Levering Lewis was my advisor. That's who trained me. And one of my dissertations focused on the robbing of Greek freedmen children. These were wealthy black children who Du Bois first wrote about in Oklahoma. All of these kids got 40-acre allotments through the Dawes Allotment Act. This was post-slavery form of reparations. And they actually got those land allotments. When Oklahoma became a state, the white folks arrived and they looked around and they saw all these Indian kids and black children with land. And some of that land had oil on it. So we all know about Tulsa, but nobody ever asked, where do all those black people get the money to start Tulsa? It was through these land allotments. And some of them were children. We're talking about 6,000 black children in Oklahoma were the state's first landowners. And so these white men came and they're like, my gosh, we gotta get this land and money from these kids. So they used guardianship laws to rob their parents of the ability to hold title or control over their children's land and money. And so these kids got white guardians. The guardians would give the parents $50 a month to take care of the kids. When Sarah Rector, who I wrote about, was making around $40,000 a month in the beginning of the early 20th century. It's all documented. I'm not making this up. And so they systematically robbed these kids. Sometimes they killed them. And when these kids would become of age of majority, there was nothing left because these white men would give their friends loans to start businesses. They would just spend the money and they robbed generations of black people of wealth. And so when I went to Oklahoma and I would go in these community spaces, there were these black people who heard stories. I heard my grandmama had this. I heard my auntie had that. But they didn't know how to go to the courts to find their DAWs, numbers, those sorts of things. They didn't know how to search the databases where all this stuff is in, open source access, newspapers, to tell those stories, to show them the evidence. I've spread stuff out on, conference tables and had families crying because they had the evidence that they were robbed. And they're like, well, what can we do with this now? So I said, I'm gonna apply for a grant and I'm gonna create a database. And we're gonna locate we're gonna use GIS data, we're gonna locate all of this stuff, and we're gonna name names because the guardians are all named, the judges are all named, it's all in the courthouse. They told us what they did. They kept it in meticulous detail. We just have to unearth it and put it in their faces and then go to a civil rights attorney and tell them the story and give them the discovery. Now go to the courts and get these people's money. It starts with the stories and the evidence because our people intuitively know something was taken. They just don't always know where to find it and how to put words to the story and give them a vision of how justice can be attained. And we don't have to go back to the plantation to do this. This is early 20th century. So I don't know those kind of black people you were talking about. Sorry.
That is wonderful.
So I'm gonna be brave and say I do know some of those black folks. So
Two things can be true.
Let me explain. So the way that I sort of think about this is, I think that because we know that white supremacy can be internalized and has been internalized by many Black folks to varying degrees, I think that the idea that there is something that Black people are owed is difficult for some African or some Black people to get their head around. It almost feels like they're advocating for something that they don't feel like they have earned. Because we've been taught that any and everything that we have to earn ourselves by the labor and the work of our own hands. And I think that the concept, for example, of intergenerational wealth is still for a lot of Black people sort of foreign and maybe uncomfortable in ways, because we've internalized and believe that, you know, these magical bootstraps that exist, that we've had to pull ourselves up by them, or we've watched family members, grandparents, parents, or whomever pull themselves up, and so we think that we have to do that too. So I think that there is this component that, like, white supremacy prevents us from accessing the understanding or the simple belief that there is a debt that is owed to Black America. I also think, sort of relatedly, you know, in conversations with Black folks, and I'm, you know, I'll admit, some of these people are my family members. They have rejected the idea that because in their sort of analytical minds, they can't really trace, you know, where does the money come from, and what is the precise dollar amount that is owed to me or to my grandmother or to my great-grandmother. And so I think for some people, I think it is a more sort of systematic or sort of analytical analysis that will help them get there. And sort of like, I think the work that Dr. Winbush and Dr. Patton have done can sort of bring people along who don't really have the, like, depth of understanding of what has actually happened and what has actually been lost or taken.
Beloved, I'm convinced that beauty is the necessary nourishment for resistance, that until we are drawn into the beauty of what it means to be human and the imagination of what's possible, we won't risk what is necessary to build a new world. So I want to leave with these beautiful words from an extraordinary and prophetic artist by the name of Donny Hathaway. Hang on to the world as it spins around. Just don't let the spin get you down. Things are moving fast. Hold on tight and you will last. Take it from me. Someday we'll all be free. If we hold on to this language, this fight, this joy, someday we'll all be free. Would you join me in thanking this extraordinary, brilliant panel?